Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's Ukrainian talk show on Pod TV. My name is Sasha Star, and today our guest is Dr. Jonathan Lockwood. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you, Sasha. Glad to be here as always.
Yes, my pleasure. And what is a very, very important announcement from the Putin himself. Russia is no longer threatening to use any nuclear weapons in this war or whatever. And therefore, he made a decision that only conventional weapons will be used in this war against Ukraine. Now, the catalyst of this happened to be a visit of Indian Prime Minister Modi to Kiev, to Ukraine. And that was really a time when Modi said it, as he did many times before, that it's unacceptable not even to use nuclear weapons, but even to talk about it. Another thing is that Putin, rightly so, calculated that while he and his assistants, I don't know what's the right way to call these people, that they were threatening several times a day in the last 2.5 years that there is a red line, that Russia is going to use tactical nuclear weapons and they're going to do this and that. And that noise was going on for 2.5 years. And actually, the more the noise was going on, the less receptive the Russian opponents were to that noise.
They realized that they had reached a point of diminishing returns by continually threatening to use nuclear weapons. I mean, after all, they referred to their own nuclear weapons as the Ustrashenia, their
Yes.
intimidation forces, nuclear intimidation forces, and so therefore, because that's how they perceive it, as a way of coercing or restraining their opponents from undertaking actions unfavorable to them. However, they quickly realized, and this may also reflect, Sasha, a realization on the part of the Russians themselves that their own nuclear forces are not as reliable in a pinch as they have been trying to intimate that they are, and so that if they actually really tried to use their nuclear forces, they might discover a very high failure rate. So there is that. And they have also seen, at least at the theater and intermediate level, that Western ballistic missile defenses are very effective. Have very high intercept rate. And so even at the intermediate and theater level, there is obviously a great deal of uncertainty in the minds of the Russian planners as to how many of their nuclear missiles would actually make it through a ballistic missile defense shield.
It appears to me, Jonathan, correct me if I'm wrong, that the Russians really they don't have a clear-cut doctrine of using tactical nuclear weapons. The strategic, okay, you can agree. Okay, they have silos, they have this intercontinental ballistic missiles developed 60, 50 years ago, 60 probably, and they have nuclear submarines that could fire. So that more or less, it all depends to see how many of them could actually fly. But okay, probably half of them, maybe 25%, but something will fly. Now, with the tactical nuclear weapon, first of all, what's happened if Ukrainian forces will intercept that over Russian territory? So what's the
That could be.
fallout of that will be?
Now, it's interesting. It's interesting to bring up the doctrine of using tactical nuclear weapons. I know of only two published documents that even intimate. And the first one was in the old Soviet Officers Library series
Mhm.
that the U.S. Air Force had translated from the Russian during the 1960s. The monograph was by Colonel A.A. Sidorenko, and
Mhm.
its title was "The Offensive." And they talked about Colonel Sidorenko talked about the use of nuclear weapons as basically a a logical extension of the Russian use of massed artillery during World War II. And according to Colonel Sidorenko's methodology, uh, the more the Russians could concentrate artillery firepower over a shorter period of time, this equated to greater rates of advance in the Russian counteroffensives in the east. That's very interesting. The Colonel Sidorenko did not bother to mention that the reason the Russians had such high rates of advance was that their logistical system was buttressed by the importation of US Ford trucks, enabling them to sustain those high rates of advance. But nevertheless, his conclusion, according to his methodology, was if massed artillery fire could result in high rates of advance, then the use of massed nuclear weapons fire along multiple axes of advance would provide the greatest and most decisive results, because nuclear weapons represent the greatest concentration of firepower in the shortest period of time. Okay, logical as far as it goes, but that is one clue, And we're in the West, we're looking at this rather curiously, as surely they can't mean that. But then in 1990, with when the Warsaw Pact collapsed and East Germany collapsed, and the West Germans went into the East German military bases and they found the Warsaw Pact's war plans. And West German journalist Lothar Ruhl wrote an article in 1990 about as late as 1989, the Warsaw Pact, apparently according to these discovered war plans, had plans to use up to 300 nuclear weapons in a strike on NATO forces in the event of a war against NATO. And the immediate reaction in the West was, number one, disbelief, astonishment, and second, a kind of breathing a sigh of relief. Wow, we dodged a bullet there, so to speak. Mm-hmm. But actually, that's kind of foreshadowing, because essentially, as far as their later use or planned use of employment of nuclear weapons was concerned, possibly the Russians might just dust off their old Warsaw Pact plans and adapt them for use against an offensive against NATO in the 21st century. Problem with that is, you have a planned offensive against trying to use those mass nuclear weapons fire against Ukraine would destroy the very territory that they would be hoping to occupy and incorporate into a Russian empire. So again, that's there are published documents, and possibly the Russians could extrapolate from that and develop and have some sort of tactical nuclear weapons employment doctrine. But in the current situation, it's very impractical, because the Russians did not anticipate the growing sophistication of ballistic missile defense. They were always afraid of Patriot and its potential as early as 1985, as I pointed out on a previous program. But they did not anticipate just how effectively Western ballistic missile defenses deployed in Ukraine could block a Russian missile attack, even a conventional missile attack. So this has given Putin a great deal of food for thought, and it probably is acting as their ballistic missile defenses in the West are in effect restraining Putin by creating great uncertainty in his mind as to just how effective would my nuclear strike be if I actually went ahead and used it. And it would be even more terrible for Putin's perspective if they tried to launch a nuclear strike and it failed and it was blocked substantially, because then there would be no reason for NATO not to take the gloves off themselves, and his fear would be a devastating nuclear counterstrike, knowing that the West was at least partly capable of blocking his nuclear strike. So all of this is a very interesting dynamic, and Modi might have been just trying to talk some sense into him, and that it's unacceptable. And his announcement that they're only going to rely on conventional weapons, okay, fine. It does not restrain the West whatsoever from continuing to increase ballistic missile defense systems for Ukraine and for the West in general. It gives us that much more incentive to create defense in order to nullify any potential offensive strikes by Russia.
There could be also economical and political consideration on Modi's arguments to Putin, because India is one of very few left suppliers and business partners of Russia. At least they're buying some oil from Russia and supplying some details. But and I don't think that Putin wanted to upset Modi, because Modi is already taking a huge risk by continuing trade with Russia, because he can be part of secondary actions from the West, and that's the last thing what Modi needs. And the trade with Russia is dying simply because Russia is accumulating a lot of rupees for their oil. The rupees is not convertible currency, so Russia hoards probably billions of rupees in Indian banks, and there's no way easily to convert that into something. So it's dying now. That's why Russia, through efforts of this uh, Russian multimillionaire, multi-billionaire, I have to correct myself. He's worth about $15 billion. Pavel Durov, who was arrested in France in Le Bourget airport in Paris, and he's I don't know if you can call him scientist or businessman or both, and but the final thing what he was trying to do is to invent, and actually it already exists by the name Ton. It's a new cryptocurrency that is being promoted through Telegram, and that could become, and because Telegram, if you notice, the major users of Telegrams are Russia, India number one, by the way, Russia, Brazil, a couple of other BRICS countries. So this is Putin's plan, which he had even before he understood what is a Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency, a plan to create alternative monetary system which would be rival a Western, whether it's dollar-based or anything else. So that was his plan. But if he would do it naturally, it will take 700 years. And Putin wanted to see something while he's still alive. And the only way to do it is to create a complete ecosystem based on the currency that he and his friends are controlling. And Pavel Durov was a very, very big arm of that. So, okay, we'll see what he is going to testify in the French courts. And I think American special forces are also quite keen on what they're going to learn there. And obviously, that if that would be ever succeed, that would create a problem of, for example, the trade balance with India, which would rupees could be converted into this hon, that new Russian, so to speak, Bitcoin, or cryptocurrency rather, and this way Russia could become a king of crypto wars. And so far, the way I understand it, crypto and Telegram is very effectively used by all kind of criminals, narco dealers, terrorists, and this is why Telegram is so popular, because the perceived uh, impossibility for secret services to really go into it and find out really what's going on, as they have some access, at least to my knowledge, to Facebook or Google or other services. Now, in the United States, Telegram is number 8 by number of users. But it's very different picture in countries like, as I mentioned, the BRICS countries and Iran, by the way, and all the terrorist organization in the Middle East, they all communicating in Telegram only. The Russian army operating in Ukraine, they're communicating by Telegram only. There is no Facebook, there is nothing else. Telegram, that's how they give orders to start shooting at Ukrainian cities and kill
And
people.
and while such a system may be relatively technologically slower than, say, our systems, they do have the advantage of being more secure and difficult to read, difficult if not impossible to read. So it's a lower level of tech. They're actually countering with a lower level of technology, hard for our intelligence forces to read. Not impossible, but difficult, much more difficult. And so that is a very interesting development. One other interesting development I was going to point out was that if here's how the presidential election could affect their strategy. For example, if we know, for example, from the Republican side that if former President Trump is elected president, one of his declared policies is known as drill baby drill, which is basically greatly expanding U.S. oil production and fossil fuels production, and basically telling the climate change people that he thinks it's a scam anyway, so he's going to go ahead and produce oil to drop the price of oil, drop the price of fuel, which would directly address the inflation problem to a certain extent in the United States, would be greatly welcomed by U.S. consumers, and at the same time, it would really put it to the Russians, because the Russians depend on oil exports for a great deal of their currency and their income. So if you drop the price of oil significantly, it puts Russia and its allies in a more difficult position.
Absolutely, and that was happened at the times of Ronald Reagan, when price of oil dropped to about $6 or $8 per barrel by
Oh,
1996.
that was lovely.
That was lovely, and
Americans were buying gas guzzlers at that point.
I remember the time. And by the way, that made Gorbachev very flexible with his approach to Americans. There was no more cyber noises, and
Well,
so
also you recall, because when Reagan declared SDI, the Soviets, the Strategic Defense Initiative, the Russians overreacted. They saw this as a genuine attempt by the United States to develop a true nuclear warfighting, war survival strategy similar to their own. And I was reading this in their pronouncements on the subject. And they saw that as a signal that Reagan was getting really serious about developing a true strategic defense. They did not fully realize, they were not taking Reagan at his word when he claimed that this is a research and development effort. They were so paranoid. They saw the deployment of Patriot, for example, as that reference that article I told you about, that in January '85 issue, the Herald of Aircraft Defense, that the Patriot, according to them, was intended to be used for the strategic defense of the United States, which we never intended to do that, but they were reading into it, that capability. And they were looking for any indication that the United States was going full bore with a strategic defense system for the United States that would potentially neutralize their nuclear arsenal. So they have been very paranoid about this for a long time. So, and interestingly enough, Gorbachev was sent a report. It was shown in the book by Christopher Andrew and Oleg Gordievsky, KGB, The Inside Story. In that book, Gordievsky relates that the KGB had sent a report to Gorbachev in April 1985, concluding that the US SDI system would eventually be able to block 90% of Soviet missiles in a first strike, and there was no way that the Soviet Union could keep up with this capability. Now, did we actually have that kind of capability? No, but the Russians believed it. They acted on that belief, and not only were they spending themselves into bankruptcy trying to counter a phantom SDI program, but Gorbachev was personally trying to appeal to Reagan to drop SDI, and Reagan would not do it. To his credit, he would not do it.
never trust Americans.
Say what?
Never trust Americans. That's a lesson.
But we have such honest-looking faces, and Reagan had such an honest, sincere-looking face.
Yes.
Yeah. So, but to the Russians, Reagan was being diabolically clever.
And never trust Hollywood actors.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Yeah, for a Hollywood actor, for him, an actor, the skills of being a good Hollywood actor and a good politician apparently translated very well because
Yeah.
he got 2 terms as president out of it.
Well, you can actually say about Trump that he is a Hollywood actor because of his show.
He
He has
exactly he
tremendous
had he
skills.
exactly he has some of the same skills for knowing what a dramatic moment looks like. And some were arguing that when in that assassination attempt, that some people were being cynical and saying that uh, he was deliberately posing in order to create a good photo op. No, he was acting on instinct. He had good instincts. He knew he had to portray strength, and he did, and it worked to his credit. Uh,
Absolutely.
so so in any case, that's all good. So some of the skills that Ronald Reagan had and used, you know, former President Trump is using in the same way. But the interesting thing is that should former President Trump win the election this November, it's going to mean lower oil prices as far as that goes through his drilling policy. Uh, Pres- uh, Vice President Harris, in her, uh, she's talking about they're accusing her of flip flopping back and forth on between banning fracking and not banning fracking.
Yeah, I saw her
Yeah.
interview yesterday.
So that is not a good look for her, certainly for her politically. But it's an interesting dynamic. It's fascinating to watch. But and Russia has to be concerned. They now have to be even more concerned that if President Trump wins the election, that it's not going to be as good a deal for them as they originally thought it was going to be.
What's interesting is that there are a lot of discussions in the Russian Ukrainian internet about this attack on Kursk region of Ukrainian army. And there are some people who are being negative about it. They're saying that these forces will be better be used to defend in Donbass the Russian excursion. And but majority and some commentators that I trust and listen to quite often, they are saying is that the purpose of this attack was to prove to Ukrainians and its Western partners that Russian territory actually is not being defended at all. It's not even poor defense. There is no defense. So, provided that Ukrainians who know how to advance in Russian territory, and if you consider that the goal of the war for Ukrainian side is not even get to the territory of 1991, because even if that could be accomplished, so in 2 years Russia start feeling another war, so nothing has been accomplished. The real goal is to change the government in Russia and to make sure that all this aggressive posturing will stop to exist. So Ukrainians proved to all world that they can invade Russian territory and they could go much farther, provided that they will have enough weapons and ammunition. So if the West could continue its help to Ukraine and will take out all restrictions on using all the weapons, specifically the ATACMS, the missiles, and there is some new missiles that are going to be supplied already in Finland and Poland, and most likely they will be soon in Ukraine. The name is ASAM. I forgot exactly. It's a new missiles which is in U.S. Army only from I think 2013. So they're really new missiles, and their radius is from anywhere from 500 kilometers and up to almost 1,000 kilometers. So they're really stepped ahead of ATACMS. And if that missiles with ATACMS and others could be used by Ukrainians, I think, with Russia, it's second uh, best army in the world, or maybe third by now, or maybe even 25th. It's not such a big deal. And if the West sees the merits of neutralizing Russia with Ukrainian army with a little bit of help, why not, Jonathan? What do you
Well,
think?
it's very interesting that the point you bring up, Sasha, because in a way there is some parallel that can be drawn between the Ukrainian strategy of invading Russia in order to achieve a political victory and what the Confederacy was trying to do during the American Civil War. Remember, if it was apparently a lot of military leaders, the consensus of the Confederate leadership was that the Confederacy could not afford simply to sit on defense, and because of the superior resources of the North, of the Union, they could not do this. And Lee, Robert E. Lee, realized this, which is what led him to invade, and his first invasion of the North at Antietam, which he narrowly escaped a decisive defeat, but it had the potential for inflicting a major defeat upon the Union. And then he followed that up after his tactical victory at Chancellorsville. He followed that up immediately with the invasion at Gettysburg, which both of those invasions of the North were intended to achieve. The objective was achieve a decisive victory of the Union Army on Northern soil, which they hoped then would trigger the intervention by Great Britain and France to negotiate an end to the American Civil War and preserve the Confederacy. So they had, because the Confederates realized they could not win a pure war of attrition or stay purely on defense. They could not be passive. And the Ukrainians have realized this in the same way. They realize they cannot depend upon pure resources in order to be able to wear the Russians down, even though they are inflicting massively superior casualties on the Russian army. The Ukrainians are suffering too. And so they have to, in order to defeat Russia, they have to invade Russian soil, inflict a demonstrable defeat upon them that is politically recognizable by the West, and put an enormous amount of pressure on Russia, both externally and internally from within, so that they are compelled to seek a peace. And they have to be compelled to do so. And the Ukrainians also obviously remember what Winston Churchill observed, that nothing the Russians respect more than strength, and nothing they have more contempt for than weakness, particularly military weakness. The Ukrainians know this better than probably anyone else. And so they are doing this, they are pressing ahead, they have kept their own counsel about their first offensive, and I predict that they will throw a second punch, a follow-up offensive somewhere else. It could well be Crimea, as I've been contending for quite some time. They have been exerting pressure against Crimea, threatening to cut off its logistic and reinforcement links, so that if they do this successfully, they could in fact achieve a political victory. Now, best possible case is achieve political victory before the November election, in which case, the whole thing becomes irrelevant in that sense.
That's true. And, this is really almost action, so-called Vabank, because 70% of all weapons and ammunition supplied from the West, they are all now in Kursk on Russian territory, believe it or not. So it's a risky operation for sure, but the old Russian saying is, those who don't risk don't drink champagne. So if Ukraine wants to taste champagne, they had to take the risk, and so far it works well for them, and hopefully it will be reinforced by other developments on other fronts in Ukraine. Jonathan, thank you very much for today's program, and we'll see you on Tuesday, same place, same time, and have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
You do the same.
Glory to Ukraine. Bye-bye, everybody.